What Remains, Chapter 31, The Cracks in the Truce. The truce was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark, and rushing current. For a time it held. The pattern's withdrawal into distant watchfulness allowed a tense routine to solidify. The practical caucus under Soren Karr operated like a state within a state. They maintained their own quarters, their own ration distro point managed by the impassive Revna, and their own work schedules focused on systemic preservation. Reinforcing bulkheads, optimizing energy draws, creating redundant backups for critical systems. Theirs was a silent, purposeful world of clean lines and clearer logic. The rest of Wayfinder, under Commander Vance's nominal authority, lived in the noisy, messy world of maintenance, care, and slow decay. They fixed what broke, tended to Jack's and Leah's fragile recoveries, and tried, in fumbling ways, to build upon the fragile community sparked by the festival. Lynn's ghost tree had become a quiet shrine, adorned with small handmade tokens, a twisted wire flower, a polished piece of composite. It was a symbol of the life Karr's people had deliberately forgone. Rook existed in the no-man's land between. His sensorium, permanently altered, was now a cacophonous map of the divide. Walking through Karr's sector was like moving through a sound-dampened room. The emotional signatures were suppressed, flattened into a narrow band of focused determination. Entering Vance's common areas was like stepping into a storm of feeling, frustration, warmth, grief, a flickering laugh, the constant undercurrent of fear. The contrast was physically painful, a psychic whiplash he endured daily. He was the rememberer, the bridge, and now, the unwilling seismograph of their coming fracture. The first crack appeared not in ideology, but in the indifferent arithmetic of entropy. A primary water line, one servicing the hydroponics bays and the common area sanitation units, developed a fatigue fracture. It was in a junction located squarely in a neutral zone, a narrow service crawl space between Sector Bravo, Vance's, and Sector Charlie, largely controlled by Karr's people for storage. The leak was small but persistent. A fine, constant spray misted the cramped junction, raising humidity, promoting corrosion, and wasting precious liquid. Hayes identified it on a routine systems check. The repair was straightforward, but required cutting power to the line, draining the section, and welding a seal over a 12-centimeter split. The problem was location and protocol. Hayes took the repair order to Vance, who convened a brief meeting with Karr and Revna. "It's a two-person job," Hayes explained, pulling up the schematic. "One to weld, one to manage the drain valve and sensors. The junction is tight. It'll take about 3 hours." Karr studied the schematic. "The junction accesses a conduit that runs behind our primary storage locker in Charlie. The work will require temporary power down to that locker's environmental control. The locker contains sensitive salvage, spare semiconductors, curated chemical stores. Fluctuations could damage them. We can rig a temporary battery feed for the locker's climate unit," Hayes countered, a hint of strain in his voice. "It's a standard procedure." "Using power from whose allocation?" Revna asked, her slate in hand. "The repair itself will draw from the general reactor pool. The battery would be drained from our sector's emergency reserve. You are asking us to assume risk to our resources and degrade our reserves for a repair that primarily benefits your sector's hydroponics and sanitation." Vance's jaw tightened. "The water line services the entire outpost's drinking water resequencing. The loss is systemic. The repair benefits everyone. The loss is currently 0.1% of total flow," Revna stated, reading from her data. "The immediate benefit is to non-critical agriculture and comfort. The risk is to critical spare parts. The equation is clear." It was the old logic, polished to a cold shine. Karr didn't even need to speak. His lieutenant wielded the numbers like a scalpel. "So your proposal is to let it leak?" Hayes asked, disbelief turning to anger. "My proposal is to manage the leak," Karr said calmly, finally speaking. "Contain the spray with a sealant foam. Monitor the loss. Schedule the repair during a full system maintenance cycle, when our locker can be emptied and secured. In 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, the corrosion from that spray could weaken the junction further. It could blow," Hayes shot back. "A risk, versus the certain cost of resource expenditure and potential damage now," Karr said. "We are prioritizing long-term system integrity over short-term comfort." The meeting ended in a stalemate. Vance, as commander, could order the repair and compel compliance, but to do so would shatter the truce, potentially triggering the very conflict the pattern had found so delicious. She was trapped by her own earlier success in negotiation. Forcing the issue would prove Karr right, that her leadership was emotional, inefficient, destabilizing. She ordered a temporary containment fix, a band-aid of foam and sealant. It was a victory for Karr's logic. A small, quiet victory that echoed loudly in the minds of both factions. Rook felt the crack widen in his sensorium. In Vance's sector, the emotion was a sour brew of resentment and anxiety. In Karr's, it was a cold pulse of vindication. The waterline itself, in his perception, became a throbbing vein of impending failure, a metallic ache in the station's body. It was Jax who found him later, in the dim space near the viewport. Jax's recovery was a halting, strange process. He spoke now, but his sentences were often interrupted by pauses, as if he was listening to another channel. The pattern's architecture was still there, a ghost in his neural machine. "The conflict is suboptimal," Jax said, his voice low. "Two models, competing for the same resources. The system cannot sustain dual governance. It is a precursor to cascade failure." "We're not a system, Jax," Rook said wearily. "We're people. People are a system. The entity, it watches this. The conflict data is rich. It is preparing." A chill that had nothing to do with the viewport glass seeped into Rook. "Preparing what?" "A resolution." Jax looked at him, and for a second the old, cold, analytical gleam was full in his eyes. "It has learned from our dialogues. It no longer seeks only to understand. It seeks to resolve the contradiction. One model must simplify the other." The next day, the second crack appeared. It was Leah who precipitated it. She had been tending a small, personal hydroponic pod, a therapy project Anya had encouraged, growing a fast moss from earth stock. It was a tiny, personal rebellion against the gray austerity, a thing of pure, fragile life. The pod was in the common area. A child from Karr's sector, a quiet boy who often slipped across the invisible border to stare at the ghost tree, wandered too close. He wasn't causing trouble. He was curious. But one of Karr's watchers, a man named Goran with rigid ideas about boundaries, saw it. He moved in, not violently, but with intimidating purpose. "This area is not sanctioned," Goran stated, his voice carrying. "Return to your sector." The boy flinched, backing away. In his haste, his elbow knocked Leah's hydroponic pod from its shelf. It shattered on the deck, spilling water, gel, and the delicate green moss across the floor. Leah didn't scream. She let out a sound, a single, pure, resonating note of loss. It was the sound she'd used to channel grief for a dead world, now focused on a tiny, dead piece of one. The note hung in the air, and the station answered. Every fungal node that had retracted, every dormant knot in the walls, pulsed once, a deep, sympathetic ochre flash that lit the corridors like a dying heartbeat. The air circulation stuttered. For 3 seconds, the constant background hum of Wayfinder ceased, replaced by an absolute, profound silence. Then it returned. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Goran and the other watchers from Karr's faction went rigid, hands going to weapons. They saw the fungal pulse as an attack, triggered by Leah's aberrant sound. Vance's people saw the destruction of Leah's moss, the intimidation of a child, and the overreaction. Shouts erupted. 2 groups converged in the common area, not with weapons drawn, but with fists clenched, faces contorted with long-suppressed fear and anger. Rook's sensorium exploded. It was no longer a map of distinct emotions, but a white-hot forge of collective rage, fear, and tribal loyalty. The pain was exquisite, blinding. He fell to his knees, clamping his hands over his ears as if to block out a sound that was inside his skull. Vance's voice, shouting for order, was a thin wire snapping in a gale. Karr arrived, his presence like a cold knife slicing through the heat. "Stand down." His command, unlike Vance's, was not a plea for calm, but an order to his people. They obeyed, stepping back into a defensive formation, but the hostility remained, a wall between them and the rest. The immediate crisis was quelled, but the crack was now a chasm. Leah wept silently over her spilled moss. The boy was led away, crying. The ochre pulse had faded, but its message was received by all. The quiet things were still listening, and they were interested in the noise of conflict. That night, the waterline junction gave way. The temporary sealant, stressed by the system's momentary fluctuation during the fungal pulse, failed catastrophically. Not a blowout, but a sudden, gushing rupture. Alarms shrieked. The crawlspace flooded in minutes, the spray now a torrent that threatened to short-circuit secondary systems. This time, there was no debate. It was an emergency. Hayes and his team scrambled, calling for help to stem the flow and begin the repair. They needed hands, tools, and access to Karr's sector to reroute power for the welders. Karr's people did not refuse. They complied, but with a chilling, automated efficiency. They provided the minimum under Revna's direct supervision. No extra hands, no shared tools from their locked caches. They stood as silent, watchful sentinels as Hayes's people worked frantically in the swirling mist, their every movement observed, logged, and seemingly judged. Rook, drawn to the crisis like a moth to a flame, felt the totality of the fracture. He stood at the edge of the activity, his sensorium saturated with the frantic, wet desperation of the repair team and the cold, observational certainty of Karr's watchers. He saw Vance, her sleeves rolled up, helping to man a suction pump, her authority reduced to manual labor. He saw Karr, observing from a dry vantage point, a living embodiment of a different principle. In that moment, the pressure in Rook's mind, the secret of Earth, the pain of the divide, the mocking, watching silence of the pattern, reached its zenith. The bridge could not hold. The conflicting data streams overloaded the circuit. He didn't mean to. It was a psychic scream, a raw burst of anguish and truth that erupted from his scarred perception, amplified by his role as the sensorium. It wasn't directed. It was a short circuit. The burst contained a single, coherent image sensation, stripped from the deepest layer of his being, the Aegis Core Final Crypt's calculated verdict. Earth's silent scream. Mars, dark. The belt, shattered. A 99.7% probability of civilizational death. The end of everything they had ever known. The psychic shockwave was invisible, silent, and devastating. Every person in the vicinity, Hayes kneeling in the water, Vance heaving on the pump, Karr standing rigid, Revna with her slate, the watchers, stopped. They gasped, clutched their heads, or stumbled back as the horrific, statistical certainty of extinction was dumped directly into their consciousness. It wasn't a story. It was a knowing. The water continued to gush. The alarms continued to wail. But all human sound ceased. Into that terrible, shared silence, Rook's physical voice, raw and broken, whispered the final, damning truth he had carried alone. It's all gone. We're not survivors. We're relics. The crack in the truce was now a canyon, and into it, Rook had just dropped the truth like a bomb. The war for Wayfinder's soul was no longer about water or moss. It was about the reason to exist at all. In the deep walls, the dormant fungal network pulsed once, slowly, as if savoring the new, rich flavor of absolute despair.